This video is made possible by the incredible journalistic work done by Richard Lloyd Parry and is based on his work, Ghosts of the Tsunami, chronicling the people and the events as they unfolded in Kamaya in 2011 when the earthquake and tsunami struck.
最愛の花へ。お葬式は楽しかった。音楽と虹と花で飾りました。あなたもあなたのお兄さんも見て喜んでくれたと思います。パパとママがあなたたちにしてあげられたのはそれだけだったのよ。結婚式当日にはドレスをたくさん用意してあげたかったし、昔の花嫁みたいに黒の振袖も用意したかったけど、でもパパとママの夢は今は夢で終わってしまいます。もしこの手紙を読めるなら、ぜひパパとママのところへ来てね。
The Pacific Ring of Fire, a semicircular arc of 40,000 kilometers, the same as the circumference of the Earth, the birthplace of nature's awesome power. Home to volcanic belts, oceanic trenches, and arc basins, it is responsible for most of the world's major earthquakes. Japan is one of only a handful of countries that lives entirely on the Ring of Fire. In Tokyo, residents know that one day it will no longer exist, a city living on the precipice. One day, a large enough earthquake will come. It's already due. And with it will come that eternal brethren, which the Japanese are so intensely aware of that we have adopted their word for it. Tsunami.
すごい津波です。
すごいですね。
すごいです。ああ、目の前で来たおりや。
すごい。現役始まって以来じゃないですか。
ああ、長かった。
わあ、あんな重いものをみんな、うわあ、すごい流されてる。
また向きにね、これね。あらららら。
動いてる。
動いてるみたいな。動いてる。動いてるね。建物動いてないだろうね。逆流がすごいです。建物動いてないの？あららら。
引き潮。
引き潮？どこまで来るんだって。
On March the 11th, 2011, at 2:46 p.m., Japan Standard Time, 72 kilometers off the coast of Japan, the tension due to subduction of the Pacific Ocean plate finally released, lifting the seafloor 30 feet over an area the size of Connecticut in an instant, causing a 9.1 magnitude undersea megathrust earthquake. The strongest earthquake to ever hit Japan, and the fourth largest in recorded history. On this day, a tragedy occurred. Almost 20,000 killed and thousands more injured or missing. But our story is a more acute tragedy, the preventable deaths of an entire elementary school. We begin in Kamaya, a small town located off of Ishinomaki in Miyagi Prefecture, directly in the path of the soon arriving wave. Chisato was 11, a fifth grader about to graduate from Okawa Elementary School. When she awoke that day, she had a terrible dream. Her mother, Sayomi, remembers her shouting about an earthquake. Everything gone. A premonition. Despite her outbursts, Chisato would still go to school that day. When the school bus came to pick her up, that was the last time her mother saw her alive. Her dream had come to life. On that day, March 11th, was Chisato's brother Kenya's graduation. Sayomi drove there soon after Chisato was picked up by the school bus. After the graduation ceremony, she and Kenya went to a celebration being held near Chisato's school. The ceremony came to an end around 2 p.m. Sayomi had a decision to make. Kenya wanted to go home, but as she was so close to Chisato's school, she wondered if she should pick her up. At Okawa, classes usually ended at 2:30 p.m., but it was always another 10 or 15 minutes before anyone began to leave. Should they wait for Chisato for what might be another half hour, or should they go home now and leave her to take the bus as usual? Sayomi stood by her car in front of the school, considering this small dilemma, and as she remembered it later, a powerful sense of the uncanny overcame her. In the end, she decided not to pick up Chisato. The earthquake will arrive within the hour. After they drove home, Sayomi was in her room when the earthquake struck. She had never felt anything so powerful. She told everyone to get outside. In the house were Sayomi, Kenya, as well as her older daughter Tomoka and her parents. She got everyone but her father out. They were all huddled outside as they waited out the shaking. Sayomi herded her parents and the children into the car and drove down the lane to a spot in the rice fields where the people of Fukuji were already converging. Chairs and mattresses were being laid out for children and the elderly, and neighbors were exclaiming to one another over what had happened. After settling her parents and children among their neighbors, she drove the few hundred yards to the river. Over the next hour, Sayomi drove backwards and forwards between the road where she waited for the appearance of the school bus and the rice field where she checked on the well-being of her family. Parry writes, quote, Sayomi went back to the main road and waited for her daughter as dusk swallowed up the day. She had been standing in front of Okawa Primary School an hour and a half ago. It should have been the most natural thing in the world to drive back down the road along the river to collect Chisato. It was only 4 miles downstream, but there were no cars at all coming from that direction. The drivers loitering at the lock said that the way was dangerous, although no one seemed willing to explain exactly why. Wet, sleety snow had begun to fall. The river was behaving as if it was possessed. The surface of the water was bulging and flexing like the muscles beneath the skin of an athlete. Large, irregularly shaped objects were dimly visible on its surface. Sayomi lingered by the river, watching the road until after it was dark. End quote. The next day, news came that a helicopter was arriving to pick up the trapped children. Sayomi's husband, Takehiro, and the other men of the village were preparing a place for it to land. Chisato was coming home at last. Little did she know that there was no helicopter, and even if there was no place to land. And even if there were no children left. Daisuke Kono didn't want to go to school that day either. He would graduate in less than a week. His mother, Hitomi, pushed him out the door. The Konos lived 3 miles downriver of Sayami's home, so Daisuke was close enough to walk to school. Hitomi's husband had already gone to work. She followed soon after her son, leaving behind her parents-in-law and 2 teenage daughters. Her workplace was across the river. After the earthquake, chaos ensued, but she eventually was able to make her way back home, or what was left of it, at least.
それは地獄でした。まるで原爆が落ちたかのようでした。
Parry writes, quote, "This comparison, for which many people reached, was not an exaggeration. Only 2 forces can inflict greater damage than a tsunami: collision with an asteroid or nuclear explosion." The scenes along 400 miles of coast that morning resembled those of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, but with water substituted for fire, mud for ash, the stink of fish and ooze for scorched wood and smoke. The dense forest of pines, which had been planted as a windbreak and a place of recreation. It was those pine trunks, 20,000 of them, that had been ripped out and transported 3 miles inland, distributing their distinctive smell. The village, the hamlets, the fields, and everything else between here and the sea had gone. End quote. Ryosuke Abe had finally arrived back in Kamaya at about the same time as Hitomi. He worked as a construction boss in the city, but he lived in Kamaya with his wife, his daughter, his son-in-law, and his 2 grandchildren, all who were in Kamaya at the time of the earthquake and tsunami. The flooded roads and broken bridge had prevented him from coming home sooner. Perry writes, quote, "Abe, Hitomi, and everyone describing the scene in the first days after the tsunami used the same word. Jigoku. Hell. The image they had in mind was not the conventional landscape of lurid demons and extravagant fiery tortures. There are other hells in Japanese iconography. Hells of ice and water, mud and excrement, in which naked figures stripped of all dignity lie scattered across the broken plain." End quote.
私の記憶に残っているのは鳥の目と医薬やゴミの下から出ている子供たちの足や丸です。
Abe, being a man of action, got to work right away. His experience on a building site came in handy. He soon went back to his car to get tools. He began to remove bodies from the wreckage and place them on the roadside. He used a shovel to dig some of them out from beneath the muck, but in other parts this wasn't possible. There were too many bodies, one on top of the other. By afternoon, others had seen Abe and began to help in the body recovery. There was no urgency. Everyone worked silently. They knew that there was no likelihood of finding anyone left alive. By the end of the first day, Abe had dug out 10 children. Most of them had lost their clothes and their name badges, but he recognized many of the faces. Later that afternoon, he got news that someone had seen his wife. He rushed to Irikamaya, where he found his wife and daughter. It was more than a matter of being relieved, he said. I couldn't believe that they were alive. But his son-in-law and 2 granddaughters were still missing. He would continue working on body recoveries for several months. One day, the woman called him over to the place where the bodies were laid out. Among them were his own 10-year-old granddaughter, Nao. Abe had lifted her out himself. She had been so covered with mud that he had not recognized her. Nao's 9-year-old younger sister, Mai, was found a week later, and their father a week after that.
猫の女の子はいつもと全く同じ様子だった。完璧だった。まるで眠っているかのようだった。
Daisuke was the first to be recovered, a week after the wave, followed by his grandfather. Rika, who had died 4 days before her 17th birthday, was found at the end of the month. Old Miss Kono and 18-year-old Mari were found in early April. 5 members of the Kono family, all dead. Daisuke was found at the bottom of the hill behind the school, in one of several small heaps of children. The girls and their grandparents were found scattered by the waves, but clues soon emerged as to what had happened. Old Mr. Kono had his car keys in his pocket. His wife was found carrying bags of clothes. Rika and Mari had charger cables and snacks. They were certainly preparing to leave. Perhaps they were even about to get into the car when the tsunami struck. Maybe they delayed, deciding to wait for Daisuke or Hitomi. We don't quite know. Hitomi went to see Daisuke at the high school gymnasium and found him uninjured. Perry writes, quote, "When she came back the next day, a jolting change had taken place. Drops of blood had issued from Daisuke's eyes, like tears. She wiped them away, but overnight, and every night after that, Daisuke shed more tears of blood. Hitomi understood that this was because of changes that were taking place inside the container of her son's body. But she couldn't help also seeing it as a symbol of the pain of his hovering spirit and of how desperately he had wanted to live." When Sayomi at last found Chisato, she was covered in mud. She was naked on a table covered in sheets. She looked calm, as if she were asleep. Sayomi lifted her up and held her, and called her name over and over, but she didn't answer. She tried to massage her to restore her breathing, but of course it had no effect. She rubbed the mud from her cheeks and wiped it out of her mouth and her nose and her ears, but she only had 2 small towels. She wiped and she wiped until the towels were black. She had nothing else, so she used her clothes. The muck was even in Chisato's eyes, and she had no towels or water, so she tried to lick them clean. But she couldn't. The muck kept coming out. When the students of Okawa Elementary awoke that day, it was a day like any other. But by the end, most would be dead. Of the 11 teachers present, only 1 survived. Of the 108 students, 30 were picked up or absent. Of the remaining 78 who were there when the tsunami struck, only 4 survived. All the kids who listened to the adults' instructions perished. So what happened? How did none of the adults present see what was happening? Even Daisuke impressed upon his teachers that they should climb the hill, but he was silenced and told to follow instructions. The events following are what occurred as reported and written by Richard Lloyd Parry in the last hour, from the strike of the earthquake to the sweep of the tsunami. The Okawa school bus was waiting in the car park with its engine running. A few of the smaller pupils had already climbed in, but most of the children were still in their classrooms, finishing up the last of their schoolwork. The 6th year class were singing happy birthday to one of their classmates. It was in the middle of this song that the earthquake struck. The teachers yelled for everyone to hold on to their desks. In Tetsuya's class, the 5th graders were getting ready to go home for the day. When the earthquake struck, they all hid beneath their desks and waited it out. When it stopped, the teachers said to follow them outside right away, so all the kids put on their helmets and went out. The school building was evacuated quickly. 5 minutes after they had been crouching under their desks, The children were in the playground, lined up in their classes, in hard plastic helmets. There were secondary earthquakes at 2:51, 2:54, 2:55, and 2:58 p.m. As early as 2:49 p.m., 3 minutes after the initial earthquake, the meteorological agency issued a warning. A 20-foot-high tsunami was expected. Everyone on the coast of northeast Japan should evacuate to higher ground. 11 adults were present in the playground, among them the 6 class teachers, the special needs teacher, Miss Suzuki, the school nurse, Miss Kono, Miss Kawabata, the school secretary, and Junji Endo, the head of teaching. In the absence of the headmaster, Teruyuki Kashiba, the senior teacher was Toshiya Ishizaka, his 54-year-old deputy. It was Ishizaka who was listening to the battery-powered radio on which the tsunami warning was being broadcast, again and again. It was on him that the fate of those waiting in the playground depended. Many people found it impossible to forgive Ishizaka, even in death. There were more aftershocks at 3:03, 3:06, and 3:12 p.m. At 3:14 p.m., the meteorological agency updated its warning. The tsunami was expected to come in at a height of 10 meters, or 33 feet. The decisions made by the teachers were informed by a manual, like all Japanese institutions, the so-called education plan. It contained within it all the protocols for sports days, parent-teacher meetings, and graduation ceremonies, as well as ethical standards. One of the sections covers emergencies and contains plans of action in the event of a fire, flood, or epidemic. It also contained a form which was to be filled out by each parent and returned. The form included the names, telephone numbers, and addresses of parent guardians, as well as anyone else who was authorized to pick up a child. This information was supposed to be reviewed and updated every year to be kept up to standards. Very obviously, and particularly important, were the plans in case of emergency, which needed to be updated. Kashiba, the headmaster, had not done this. The education plan consisted of the same template, which was then revised according to the particular situation of each school. A school inland, for example, could easily remove sections on tsunamis. Ishizaka and Kashiba had retained the section on tsunamis, but had not revised it for Okawa Elementary. Thus, it retained the generic wording of the original template, which afforded no exact area of evacuation in the case of emergency. It read, primary evacuation place, school grounds. Secondary evacuation place, in case of tsunami, vacant land near school or park, etc. The instructions were completely vague and unhelpful. School grounds, vacant land, park, all of these made little sense in the context of Okawa, so the question still remained, where to go? Here is where the lack of preparedness reached a fever pitch, and the decisions made by Ishizaka and the other teachers who could have spoken up made little to no sense. Ishizaka simply stood in the playground, puzzling over these words, vacant land near school or park, etc. The school bus was idling in the car park. With a capacity of 45 at a squeeze, it could have, in 2 trips, taken all the teachers and students to the heights of the Ogatsu Pass. On the eastern edge of the village was also a hilltop Shinto shrine, high enough to provide safety. But there was a closer and still more obvious place of safety. The village of Kamaya was surrounded by 3 major landmarks: the Kitakami River to the northwest, the rice paddies to the east, and a large forested hill to the south. Though mostly treacherous and steep to climb, there was an accessible path with a gentle slope, and furthermore this path was known to teachers and students. In fact, in previous years, the children had climbed the hill to grow a patch of shiitake mushrooms for their science class. Even the youngest children could have made this climb, and within 5 minutes, placed them well beyond the reach of any conceivable tsunami, hundreds of feet above sea level. Any of these actions could have saved the lives of most, if not all, of the students and teachers present. The action Ishizaka did take, however, is as tragic as it is baffling. Lack of preparedness, as well as the inability to produce a timely response to the incoming tsunami, played major factors. Another factor that may have come into play was the fact that residents of Kamaya didn't consider themselves at great risk. Tsunamis were in their minds a coastal hazard for towns right by the sea, fishing communities. They were a farming village, in their minds a category apart. The distance from Okawa to Matsubara Beach was about 2.25 miles. The Kitakami River also played a role, giving the tsunami a further channel into land and concentrating it into an even more powerful wave. Mr. Ishizaka makes a realization that the tsunami is arriving and suddenly gives instructions. He directs the students to follow him, and obediently they line up and file out of the playground. He leads them to the traffic island, 400 yards away, where the road meets the Great Kitakami Bridge, right into the incoming wave. A roaring sound, a black mass of rushing water, a sheet of white spray. Daisuke and some of the older kids recognize this and begin to pelt in the opposite direction. Some of the younger kids seeing this are confused. The water was not streaming in from the direction of the sea, but from the left, the direction in which they had been ordered to run. Those at the front froze at the sight of the oncoming wave. Yuki Sato and Daisuke Kono, the two 6-year boys who had pleaded with their teacher to be allowed to escape up the hill, who had been refused, had both perished in the wave. As I sit here writing this now, I cannot fathom what they must have felt, and what happened to these children brings me not only to tears, but along with it comes anger. How was this possible? Where was the preparation or even the use of common sense? And I can only imagine my sadness and anger must be multiplied 100-fold for those whose children were lost to these waves. The parents of Okawa Elementary would soon learn how their children had died. The tragedy of Okawa Elementary School stands as one of the most devastating failures of disaster response during the 2011 tsunami. The truth slowly eked out as parents learned of the events which unfolded. 2 years and 364 days since the disaster. At the last possible day, it was legally possible. The families of 23 children who had died in Okawa were suing the city of Ishinomaki and Miyagi Prefecture in the Sendai District Court. They accused them of kashitsu, negligence. It took until 2016 for witnesses to take the stand and give evidence against Ishinomaki City and Miyagi Prefecture. The case was centered around 2 questions. Could the teachers have foreseen the coming of the tsunami? And if so, could they have saved the children from it? The Sendai District Court delivered its verdict on October the 26th, 2016, 5.5 years after the tsunami. For this ending section, I will quote Richard Lloyd Parry, who was present at the courthouse when the verdict was given. In front of the Sendai courthouse, reporters and photographers were milling lazily. A ripple of animation passed through them at the arrival of a procession, slowly making its way through the sunshine. It was the plaintiffs, the mothers and fathers of the Okawa children, walking along the pavement, 3 abreast. They wore black. Several carried framed photographs of their sons and daughters. The 3 men at the front held a wide banner. Around its margins were the faces of the 23 children named in the case, photographed at home, at school, or playing outside, laughing, smiling, or solemn. In the center was a sentence of Japanese, the characters carefully hand-painted with an ink brush. We did what our teachers told us. The doors of the courtroom were opened, and everyone took their places. I looked at the black-clad parents. How many hours I had spent talking to them over the years, in conversations filled with intense and sometimes unbearable detail. They had spoken to me about each stage of the lives of their children, in childhood, infancy, even in gestation. Grief was in their noses like a stench. It was the first thing they thought of when they woke in the morning, and the last thing on their minds as they went to sleep at night. They remembered the school and the community of families of which it was the focus. They described the disaster and its unfolding, the blows of realization that followed, and the asphyxia of loss and of survival. A door opened noiselessly, and all at once the three judges, a young woman and two middle-aged men, were seated in their black gowns. The judge in the center began speaking quickly, quietly, and without inflection. The Japanese he used, formal and legalistic, was beyond my grasp, so I focused instead on the faces of the listening parents. There, surely, I would immediately be able to read the verdict, in their anger or jubilation. The faces looked intently at the judge. They frowned in concentration. Their features were blank and expressionless. And then, as suddenly as they had began, it was all over, and the occupants of the court were standing up and filing out. The parents were on their feet too. They exchanged no words or glances. They looked grave and even grim. And yet, towards the end, I thought I had been able to follow part of the judge's ruling, the part when he seemed to be ordering the defendants to pay what sounded like a very large sum of money. I stepped out into the corridor where the Japanese reporters were huddled, comparing notes. I had not misunderstood. The Okawa parents had won their case. They had been awarded more than 11 million. All their children were still dead.